I my kids, like probably many of you who have kids, are starting to get into things like TikTok even. And so, of course, that was prescient in my mind. And so I thought, well, let's see what is going on TikTok. I thought I might find some more interesting things, but it turns out there's a lot of rubbish on TikTok. And so I have actually pulled some video from that to look at today. But more importantly, this is meant to be a panel in which we might kind of mix together some discussion and clips and video and people speaking on the internet. As I say, I don't really know how it's all going to stitch together, but let's see how it goes. And please forgive me and us if things go wrong. I've put a suggestion in the comments. Hopefully everyone can see it. I know people don't get to see comments when they've just joined, so I'm just going to post it again. I don't know. So, sorry for the repetition. About how maybe you want to lay out your screens, but of course it's totally up to you. So I think we should get started. There's a couple of kind of house things to talk about. We are going to, if all the panelists are okay with it, record the session. Emily will. And we are also currently streaming it to YouTube. If anyone feels like tweeting that YouTube link, please go ahead, because I know some people have been using that to see some of the content, because you have to log in otherwise on Zoom. Emily, is there anything else that we need to cover on that front?
I don't think so.
No. And the other thing that I want to say is a huge thank you to Emily Barker, who has been just running this show this week incredibly smoothly. And so thank you very much, Emily.
No worries.
So we've got 3 panelists and also a video contribution today. The 3 panelists are as follows: Laura Forlano, who's a writer and social scientist and designer at the Institute of Design at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Sarayu Natarajan, sorry Sarayu, is a political scientist and founder of the Aapti Institute in Bangalore, India. Bakita Kasadha is a peer researcher at the Terrence Higgins Trust, who also is working on the INTUIT project at Northumbria and the Open Lab. Many of you will know that project. And Daniela Rosner investigates social, political, and material circumstances of technology development in the at the Human-Centered Design and Engineering Center at the Department at the University of Washington. So thank you all. And we've got such an amazing international group of panelists. I think we're probably spread quite globally, although Daniela is on sabbatical in Berlin. So she's a European representative right now, seeing as we're not in Europe anymore. So I also just wanted to kind of acknowledge our positionalities here. I think many of us obviously stem from particular epistemologies and positions that are oriented and located within white Anglo-Saxon ways of thinking. I think Sari in particular brings a different kind of scholarship to the table, but I know Daniela, Laura, and myself work hard to try and think about ways of interjecting other kinds of thinking into the sort of mainstream scholarship that we already inhabit. So the way, oh, I should also briefly introduce the kind of underlying theme to this session, which is systems of injustice. One of the things that's preoccupied me for, I guess for years now, is that there are these socio-technical structures that underlie the ways in which we interact with technology that they don't only shape how we work with technology, but they shape the very ideas that we have, the values that we have, that the relationships we have with technology are not just, if you like, at a surface level, at the level of interaction, which many of us in HCI tend to be preoccupied with, but run much deeper than that, that in many ways, how we see the world, how we value it, etc., are bound up and entangled with the ways we use technology. And so this is what I mean by systems, if you like, not just technical systems, but the very systems that we come to think with and work with in the world. And that, of course, in using those systems, we also bring certain ideas of value and justice and injustice. And so the speakers that, or the panelists that we have joining us for this session have really thought hard about these entanglements. And so it's a real pleasure to have them involved. What we're going to do is step through a series of sort of 4 questions or provocations. If we get that far, we might only handle a couple of them. And I might, we'll see how it goes, interject some video along the way. Some of that video might feel anachronistic or not quite fit with the conversation, but I think that's kind of okay. We should just let it happen. So I wanted to start with a very brief video clip, and then I'm going to ask Laura and Daniela a question about a broader question about technologies and systemic forms of discrimination and violence. I should also say that there's undoubtedly we're going to hit the clock on the hour at 4:30 UK time. We're at least some of us are happy to stay a little bit longer, but if people have to go and drop off, of course, that's absolutely fine. So let's just see how that goes. So now I need to figure out how to close this. So I'm going to show you a very quick clip from the video I've been presenting. It's a video by a documentary filmmaker, from a documentary filmmaker called Adam Curtis. Many of you will have come across Adam Curtis. I'll just run that video. Hopefully this is going to work. Okay. Screen sharing has stopped. Okay, so I need to see waiting room. Okay, I'm going to need to share screen again. Sorry about this, everyone. Oops.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The ultimate political goal at the heart of our age is the idea of individual freedom.
I believe that freedom is the future of all humanity.
In Britain, our government has set out to create a revolution that will free individuals from the control of old elites and bureaucracies. A new world where we are free to choose our lives, not be trapped by class or income into predestined roles.
To liberate Britain from all the old class divisions, old structures, old prejudices.
To liberate the individual.
And abroad, in Iraq and Afghanistan, Britain and America have set out to liberate individuals from tyranny. For those leading it, it is just a first step in a global revolution for democracy. But if one steps back and looks at what has resulted, it is a very strange kind of freedom. The attempt to liberate people from the dead hand of bureaucracy has led to the rise of a new and increasingly controlling system of management driven by targets and numbers. While governments committed to creating freedom of choice in all areas have actually presided over a rise of inequalities and a dramatic collapse in social mobility. The consequence has been a return of the power of class and privilege.
Okay, so the first question I have is to Laura and Daniela, and the only reason I've broken these up into pairings is to kind of keep the conversation moving, but I think, oh, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Of course, you know, everyone would have an opinion on this, but so I'm particularly interested in how both you, Laura, and Daniela have thought about the entanglements between technologies and systemic discrimination and violence in your own work. And this is really just a starting point to think about how technologies are somehow implicated or entangled in these systems of injustice, rather than to stand back and look at justice at the moment. So Laura, would you be willing to take a stab at that?
Sure, and thank you so much, Alex, for bringing us all together, and also for the wonderful video contributions. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, and I think, you know, my work over the last decade or so has looked at the ways in which these systems have come together across a wide variety of scales. So everything from looking at networked medical devices and the body, and the ways in my autoethnographic work, you know, the ways in which I myself am co-opted into a need to track and collect data and monitor data, report data, and those kinds of things. So that's very present and aware, but I also think about it from, you know, if we want to really zoom out to the city scale and follow some of these smart city projects, things like sensor systems collecting data about environmental factors in cities like water quality or air quality, and the visions of corporations, in particular, Sidewalk Labs, General Electric, Facebook, Amazon, and others that build, you know, campuses or seek to occupy territories in which they can build these, you know, internet, you know, cities from the internet up, in which that can really serve as a test bed and pilot for all manner of data collection. So, you know, I would say that that's sort of the ways in which it's come into some of the projects that I've done in the past.
Yeah. It's funny to start with this question, because I spent a year a little bit distanced actually from the workings of technology in particular. I've been at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, which has has sort of overlaps with histories of technology for sure, but then also looks at those sort of wider questions of medicalization and, you know, sort of wider forms of knowledge production over time across the globe. And the sort of way in which, I don't know if I would call it my work, but the collaborations that I've taken up has tackled these questions of violence is actually in thinking about the disconnect between the way we read and theorize these violences and the way we enact a politics, you know, actively against those, you know, to sort of fighting or challenging those logics. And I think I've found, maybe because I've sort of been spending time within a more humanities centric world, that there is a very large, significant, and vital need to entangle those logics, to really learn how we can sort of turn an intellectual grasp of, for example, anti-Black racism into also a sort of a practice of actively fighting against those logics, as we can see in the, you know, in the sort of heightened presence of this in our news channels. So for example, a couple of days ago, I think it was that there's an example of, you know, algorithmic police surveillance used to falsely jail a man named Robert Williams, who is from Michigan, and sort of hold him behind bars for 30 hours, right? Just because of a sort of false facial recognition glitch. And not just because, and this is sort of getting at the questions, it's the sort of links between the particulars of obviously the algorithm and the data set and the various forms of the technological control that are enabled, and then the sort of layers by which we then instantiate this kind of tool within a society that's entrenched with sort of anti-Black racist ideas and manifestations. So I think that kind of set of questions really came up against a lot of the readings we were doing in terms of troubling, sort of epistemologies of colonialism within Max Planck, where we'd be reading, for example, writing by Sylvia Wynter or Fred Moten and people that are very much theorizing from a sort of Black studies stance these histories of dehumanization, and yet where in practice in the Institute itself is a very white space, and it centers whiteness, and there's a continuation of this perpetual kind of white supremacist ideal. And so there's this sense that we're in HCI very much caught up in this question of how to put our politics into practice, and to challenge us as researchers to reject this practice theory divide that, I mean, comes up again and again, almost seems trite, right, at this point. But I know that's a quite abstract answer, but it's really what I've been thinking about in the kind of current moment.
I think, I think both your references speak to, for me, how widespread and pervasive these forms of entanglements are. And, you know, I really love Laura's work looking at kind of diabetes and the monitoring of diabetes through mundane technologies. But by the same token, Daniela, your questions around this kind of mass surveillance that, you know, of course is implicated in the racism that we see in the streets of the US and pretty much everywhere else at the moment. You know, that we're, in a sense, it's inescapable that these techno-scientific structures are present and impacting and shaping our experiences and our values. And that, you know, that I think, as you say, Daniela, that's incumbent on us in HCI to be paying attention to those things. We're complicit in these worlds that we're making. You know, from Laura's ideas around kind of a diabetic system that, you know, some of us may well have been involved in, to modes of surveillance that, of course, we're building the capacities for in, you know, ubiquitous computing, etc. You know, we need to ask ourselves, you know, how are we complicit in these worlds? So I want to skip, this is slightly odd because the videos are really short, but I did want to show a couple of TikTok videos. And I thought, to me, you know, some of you may not have looked through TikTok, some of you probably will have. And just in spending the last week or so looking through it, you know, I just was interested in the kinds of content that we have. So, you know, by no means am I trying to present the things that I'm going to show as things that I would support myself, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that we might see, and they're short. So this one, I think, let's see, hold on, I need to share the video. Okay, this is very short. Is the quality good enough for you to read the text on this? Okay, I'm just going to let it play. Fine. So I guess one of the things to pay attention to is the number of likes. So presumably the number of likes is just a subset of the number of views. And the number of likes is 243,000. So, you know, if we had a citation rate like that, we'd be very pleased. So, you know, these modes of presentation obviously speak to much wider audiences than we would be used to.
See, when I read that, everything is true. See, when I read that, everything is true.
So the text reads, nobody was saying straight pride until we said gay pride. Nobody was calling themselves meninists until we became feminists. Nobody was saying all lives matter until we said Black lives did. If your only reason for trying to start a moment is to take attention away from another moment, you might want to look at your real intentions behind this. And the way that this gets phrased really, for me, echoes Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life, that kind of tone and pitch of language, and I really liked that. Sorry, my son's just asked me a question. What would you like? Not right now. Can I go on the Nintendo? Wait, please just play. I'm just talking. Okay. So the next video is just one more. I'm going to show one more TikTok video. Let's see, is this going to work? Can you see that? Is that the next window pop open? Okay, this is a short, again, another short video. Well, I guess they're all short because they're all a minute long. But again, look at the number of likes there, 2.2 million.
Oh, look at me, I put a face on. Wow! Look at me, I put a show on when I go. Oh, look at me, I put a face on. Wow! Look at me, I put a show on when I go. Oh, look at me, I put a face on.
Okay, obviously it just repeats itself there. So the thing to say here is that I don't know who posts these. I think it's an activist, and I'm not sure if they're black or white. There's a history of them presenting these materials, and obviously they're presenting a kind of reactionary video against the police in this case, who are firing canisters at the public. So let's just move on from that. So I wanted to ask Sarayu and Laura a question now. In such an intense time, when the enormity of events seems so alarming, and I don't think we should be turning our attention away from things like COVID, but clearly also the race issues that are were triggered in the US, but are obviously having an impact worldwide. How should these things, if you like, matter in terms of that relationship between technology and justice? And in what ways are they present in your own work? Again, that kind of idea that questions of race or questions of subjugation are somehow being addressed in your own research. So, Sarayu, would you like to take a stab at answering that?
Sure. Thank you so much, first of all, for bringing us all together. It's great fun. Thinking about I must say that I know less or pretty much close to nothing about race. All I know is from reading and observing, but the experience around race in India, where I live and work, is somewhat different. And very many of those experiences are aligned along less, I guess, apparently visible categories like caste. So I think that some of where I'm coming from speaks to those experiences more than race, I guess. I'd like to step back from thinking about technology more broadly to actually thinking about the ways in which technology has actually enabled some of this, rather to interrogate why technology and looking at the social technical structures around it is relevant in thinking about questions of justice. And bring it to the time that we're in, which is the pandemic, and the government in India is definitely considering very strongly laying down the digital architecture that will deliver services, that will deliver welfare, that will deliver a huge number of programs directly to citizens. And what this means for the population in the context of India is really something to consider. Now, our own research, and we're looking at last mile access to technology in the context of municipal services. And one of the things that we find is that while there is an atomized way in which people can access the state, like through an app or through a web portal, the actual preference that very many of those that we spoke to is to use some kind of intermediation. So to rely on a local leader or a local politician or somebody else. So the idea that of the state in that sense, right, is very much that of a person and not of a technology or a portal or something that you could use. Now, what also this person does, this intermediary, in the political science literature, this person is called various things. some of the terms I don't like, but they're called different things. So this intermediary plays a critical role in interpreting the state, and in some ways also interpreting the citizen to the state. But they're not just that, they're also in some senses dispensers of justice, and it's problematic, I'll accept, but what they do is use discretion to ensure that welfare, which is a scarce resource, or the public distribution system, so the rice food grains that come are distributed to the right beneficiaries. So some of it is not programmatic in the sense that it's not according to a written set of rules, but what they do is they interpret the rules according to their own understanding of the context or their own sense of justice. So to think that we can think of systems of technology without considering those that interpret justice around it is to me a bit problematic. And I think that when we talk, and especially in the context of the pandemic, especially in a context like India, where you're talking about huge exclusions, like just in the pure digital sense as to who has access to phones and who has access to the internet, and who has access to the state more broadly speaking, but also in the ways that this is really the all of discrimination manifesting itself. So if you did not have access to these things in the first place, so you did not have your national identity number, or you did not have access to your phone, or you don't have your bank account, you're already excluded. And these lines of exclusion are anyway drawn along the lines of gender and caste. So here you are in a situation where you're trying to move the state much more towards delivering services digitally, but you've not understood or addressed questions of exclusion, especially because you're trying very much. And a lot of this is, it's not just the idea of touch as you will get the virus, right? But a lot of it is also touch because of notions of caste and ritual purity. So to be able to think about justice without considering this human layer for me is a bit limited. And what we try to do in our work is to do much more of that. So ask how, a lot of it is functional. So we work with organizations that do some of this work. So how can you support these intermediaries to do their work better? So yes, I would love for us also to talk about how technology, the state, and questions of justice intersect on the ground.
Thank you, Sarayu. Daniela, would you like to follow on from that?
Is it my question now?
Are you able to speak to your work that intersects across technology and justice? I don't know if you want to speak to what Sarayu said or just refer to your own.
So much of my work is collaborative, and so I've been thinking about it across a number of contexts. And before coming to Berlin, a lot of this was in the realm of sort of what we do as academics, which is often, we teach our students to build technology as part of curricula. We think through what are the sort of methodologies or, epistemological frameworks that they'll take up to make things in the world that affect the world in meaningful and just ways. And I think that sort of questioning of our very tools, at the level of sort of design methods has been one of the kind of touch points for me, again, before coming out to Berlin this year. And so I think that, examples of that are super varied, from very simple kind of interventions that Cynthia Bennett and I've done around empathy as a kind of, a question that's posed to many people to sort of design with yourself in the place of another, this metaphor of stepping into someone else's shoes, and this sort of troubling ramifications of that when the designer is in a sense then displacing the experience of the non-designer. And the case we looked at was of designers who are non-disabled, who are necessarily designing for someone with disabilities, and thus casting them also as a non-designer, and making this sort of very concretized split between those with the authority or the sort of the ability to authorize design choice and those without. And that sort of casting of empathy as a kind of a mode of connection, you're also kind of obscuring the kind of forms of agency that exist already. So the idea that someone with disabilities is always kind of actively shaping the world, and that designers are also disabled people, and disabled people are also designers, right? This sort of like entanglement of identities that we just don't often allow in our very methods. And that's kind of where empathy comes in again. It's like the example of simulation tactics, where you might put on a blindfold as a non-blind designer to understand what it's like not to have sight, and yet that erases the experience of someone who is blind from the real input of the design process. So an alternative approach would be actually as someone who is a non-blind designer to work with those with blindness to design, or to not erase themselves from the process altogether, for example, to step back and cede space. So there's many activities that we don't really include in our classes and our experiences of designing, of crafting design methods. So that's sort of one example. And I would say that very much, you know, in the coming months, I am interested in both redesigning curricula to reflect some of these projects that we've been doing, but also examining how, you know, the wider mechanisms beyond the classroom that we can intervene within. And that really takes understanding the methods they're not just things that travel as commodities in the world, they're also sort of actively contributing to our habits of being, the way we take up and learn and enact our values. And so this kind of gets at a question I think we'll talk about later, where we're thinking about structural change, or the conditions through which we might see alternative futures.
Thank you, Daniela. I think Sarayu and Daniela are drawing out some really important points about these wider structures, and that, you know, of course, many of us have our heads down looking at the technologies, but there are so many other structures that are coming to have an influence and that shape the justices and injustices that are played out through these technologies. And those are structures that are, of course, present in how we inhabit a contemporary moment, but they also have long histories. And I just wanted to point to a comment that Michaela's made in the chat, which is a really important point, and I'm really glad she's picked up on it. And I first of all, I want to apologize for my use of language. And I know, you know, that language right now really matters. And so Michaela points out that when I talk about the current moment, of course, histories of racism and exploitations around Black people and race are not in the current moment, but have long-standing histories. And so thank you, Michaela, for making that point. So when I think of structures, you know, I'm very much thinking in that Foucauldian sense of both historical, but also, as Sarayu points out, governmental structures that are not couched within a particular moment in history, but are threaded through history. But they're also threaded through history in this sort of materialist sense, a feminist materialist sense, that they come to matter as things, and that's why, you know, things like diabetes systems, as well as systems built for the blind and vision impaired, etc., all come to matter with these histories and within these sort of larger structures. I'm sorry we can't kind of pause on these conversations because they're all so incredibly generative. So I'm going to turn to a couple of other videos now. I'm just keeping an eye on time as well. We've got about 20 minutes of the allotted time left. So I think one of the points that, I was hoping that Sarayu was going to bring up is that, of course, questions of colonialism in India and of how we understand the idea of governance within India and how they intersect with class is something that I think in the UK, at least, we're very afraid to talk about. And of course, many of you will know on the calls that we've been very cautious and tentative about responding to those issues, the history that Britain plays in the Asian subcontinent. So I did want to play a short video, and some of you may have watched this already, in which Arundhati Roy, the author, not the non-fiction fiction author, writes about her, talks about her essay, "The Pandemic is a Portal." So it's a much longer YouTube clip that I'll paste a link to, but I'll just show a clip from that video now. Let's see if I can do this.
Happening right now, what's happening is that national authoritarianism is colluding with international disaster capital and data gatherers, and they are preparing another world for us, which will be, if corporate globalization was advanced capitalism, now we are going to move, now they would like us to move into an even more advanced version of that, where you have, the Gates Foundation more or less owning WHO, deciding public policy and how to make massive profits out of whatever protocol is going to be rolled out to deal with this epidemic, and that will involve data gathering and surveillance. And if we were sleepwalking into a surveillance state, now we are panic running into it, because this fear is being cultivated in us,
I'm just going to show one more video, and this is the video that Bakita Kasadha has shared with us, who's working on the INTUIT project at Northumbria and now the Open Lab. So this is I think it's about 2 minutes, and Bakita is also a poet, so she's reading one of her poems. She studies the role of technologies and community technologies amongst people with HIV.
It's more than just numbers for us. As you count viral loads, the tiny cells, we count birthdays, diagnosis, anniversaries, loved ones, moments, how we'll make it through the day. This life running through our veins goes beyond loads, beyond statistics, percentages. If you only see 90% of us, where does that leave the 10, 10, 10? It's greater than quarterly and annually, more than overseas occasions. This is daily. It's more than just an event for us. Do you only count the ones who look a certain way, who sound a certain way, move a certain sort of way, pray a certain type of way, were born in a certain kind of place, love in a restricted way, even when they don't think your way? Global gags, silencing, separating us from ourselves, halting our movement, left behind. Legislations let us slip away. We are pushed aside by policy. Laws leave us behind, laws that strangle us, that break us, keeping us out of your systems, funding streams that don't reach us. You speak in a language we don't understand, and you don't try to learn our rhythms. Scrutinizing our behavior, overlooking how it has us backed into a corner, and when we are let in, we must fold into ourselves and crush. It's more than just speeches to us. Meet us where we are. Legislations that let us breathe, policies that protect the person, laws that fight for our lives. We have traveled days to be here. We have traveled days to swallow. We are more than pills a day. We deserve dignity on our third line to life. Instead of holding up numbers, hold up people. We will enlighten you. You have a lot to learn from us. Thank you.
So what I like about setting Arundhati Roy, oops, hold on, YouTube kicking in. What I like about Arundhati Roy and Bakita's videos in combination is, again, this sense of dissonance, because they're dealing with such different things, but at the same time, that idea that the machinery of healthcare, the machinery of observation and surveillance are still doing this work on bodies, if you like, still making presumptions about the normative structures that shape bodies, the ways in which we should see bodies and intervene in those bodies. And I think, these are the questions, again, I think we need to ask ourselves as agents complicit in the making of these technologies. How do we want bodies to be imagined? So I want to speak to that kind of question of individuals and structures in this third question. So I've made a mistake here in terms of my order of who I should be asking what. So I'm going to somehow, how am I going to do this? So this is a question to Daniela and Laura. Actually, this is a question to all of you. So I think we're often tempted to divide worlds, to find ways of making them manageable. An example of this is the differences we often draw out between the individual and the structural, between individual forces and structural forces. So a psychology versus a sociology, or individual actors versus systems or networks. So in what ways, if any, have you considered the resonances and frictions between the ideas of individuals and structures? Let's see, Laura, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about recently is the area of persuasive design and why it is so attractive as an approach, right? And it very much focuses on more of a psychological and individualistic level towards specific kind of behavior changes, which might be proposed as things like saving money or losing weight, as seen as these idealized goals, but clearly they're very political and they are very much prescribing who gets to exist in this world and who should be written out or dehumanized. And so, and I, thinking back to the book Eugenic Design by Christina Caudill, I mean, she talks about the early development of the design field and the ways in which some of the star designers were very obsessed with evolution, and they were breeding animals in their bathtub, and they were just fascinated, and they thought that they should make longer shoes for city people because city people walked faster, and these kinds of strange interventions. And so I do think that we're living through some fairly dramatic changes in the design field. If you look at certainly the ways in which persuasive design is used to nudge consumers to buy certain things or vote a certain, citizens to vote a certain way, the ways that platforms are then, in a way weaponized against ourselves, and we lose our own autonomy. So it's definitely, I think, at that level of human autonomy. And I think that is a huge concern. And since, I approach it more from a structural or socio-technical perspective, I think in some ways, if we, like with environmental issues, we often say, well, actually, individual changes are great. You can use, reusable bags and things like that, but really the main polluters are huge industries. And so if they don't change, really very little will change. And I think we could see that in the COVID crisis, where, despite the fact that there was much less flying, there was still a lot of pollution because companies were still flying planes around and things like this. So I just think if you can't really discount the individual actions and changes that we might be able to make, but at the same time, The structural ones I think are far more important that we make, but those might seem more abstract to people. So one thing that's really come across for me in terms of, I think, shifting from what perhaps 10 years ago I might have thought of as questions of ethics or values, really shifting to equity and justice as a visceral, a real visceral feeling towards the need for change. And I think that means very much in our scholarly work. I mean, it can often mean a different approach to the writing, a different tone of voice in the speaking. And I think lastly, what I'll say, kind of wrapping that up, is that there was a really great talk yesterday by Alondra Nelson and Joan Donovan. And in that conversation, Joan had mentioned that today, we are creating the new categories, like in this COVID crisis, the new categories that are being created today in these contact tracing systems and digital systems are going to shape our life for possibly the next several decades. And so that, to me, and I thought about other presentations I've seen recently looking at things like bureaucratic forms and the ways in which, census forms, birth certificates, all of these bureaucracies that are created in these structures are how we shape the possibilities of our conditions of living. So that's sort of my thought on that.
Thank you, Laura. I think you nicely illustrate how, the individual is inseparable from these structures. The mundane act of filling in a form is, of course, already a structural work. So, Sarayu, would you like to add to that conversation?
Not really. I think that this is quite a lot to process.
Yeah, there is a lot going on in this. Thank you. Daniela?
Yeah, I guess it would be a good time to bring in what you and I, Alex, are doing together, doing a couple of different things, but a choice we made last summer was to take on a role as editor-in-chief of Interaction magazine, which is this, ACM SIGHI kind of public-facing or trying to be public-facing platform for scholarship, or for thinking through what the role of technology is in society and design research. And we kind of decided to do this as individuals, right? As sort of people that are simply making a kind of a choice of what to do with our time, but also thinking of it as a kind of structural choice in the sense that we only agreed to do it as under the condition that we would be able to shape the conversation to be more in line with progressive ideals, with value-based discussion, with kind of an equity and justice platform. And I think this is showing up in so many different ways across our field, from the things that we've been trying to highlight that have come out just a few days ago, the call to action by Christina Harrington and colleagues that include many people from the HCI community, and Yolanda Rankin, Jasmine Jones, Robin Brewer, Serena Arete, and Tawana Dillahunt, so many more. And the idea that these interventions are vital ways of keeping the community accountable, keeping ourselves accountable, and that we have so much work to do, us being specifically you and I, Alex, and then also those that have been most privileged in the HCI and ACM communities. And so I think this reckoning with privilege, and white privilege in particular, but privilege, it's broadly speaking, as you mentioned in this very opening, and sort of thinking about positionality as something that I think is a lifelong work, and really takes addressing the kind of mechanisms of unlearning and learning that need to be done among people like me and people with particular kind of privilege, and that is something that I guess I've been, and this shouldn't be surprising, but I've been encountering in different ways here in Berlin than I did in Seattle. And here, just as a really small example, the term race in German as Rasse, and Rassismus is racism. And these terms have been fully stigmatized in among Germans, but mainly white Germans. And this is, due to the sort of Nazi past, where these terms were used very much as a tool for this, the genocidal violence. And this is something that is really challenging to talk past, because or to really reckon with within the society here, or within even Berlin, a fairly progressive place, and within the academic institutions I'm a part of, and because it sort of perpetuates a kind of colorblindness logic, where the idea that if we don't name it, then we're letting the social do its thing. We're not perpetuating it. In fact, of course, you are not undoing by just erasing or ignoring racism, right? You are absolutely perpetuating it via the mechanisms of erasure. And so there's this dialogue happening, and it's not just in Germany, obviously, and it's not just in the US, and it's not just in Sweden or all these places. It's across the field of HCI, and that we really need to be reckoning with what it means to deal with positionality and accountability, collective accountability in the field. And this, of course, comes back to the fact that it's structural and personal, and very much part of our everyday actions.
Thank you, Daniela. It's really nice to kind of bring this back to HCI, and I think certainly, I know, well, you and I have been really trying to grapple with that question of, how we contend with these things, both individually and structurally within our field, HCI and CHI. It's 26 minutes past, so we should officially be finishing, but I'm gonna carry on, and if the panelists have to drop off, that's absolutely fine. And maybe I should just say, a huge thank you right now. And if you can hang on, do. If participants need to leave, then I understand as well. But maybe we can come to the last question and then try and have a bit more of a conversation. I'm sorry it's kind of gone on, but in a way it was anticipated that we probably should have booked a longer slot for this. So I'm going to just show one more video. I think it's only a minute long, and then we're going to come to a question that sort of course, weighs on all of us around change and activism. Let's see.
You asked what real change might look like, and I think that is a really interesting question for liberals and radicals, because there is a hunger for change out there among millions of people who feel sort of insecure, uncertain about the future, and do want that to change. I think that change only comes through a big imaginative idea, the sort of picture of another kind of future, which gives people, which connects with that fearfulness in the back of people's minds and offers them a release from it. That's the key thing. But I think the question for liberals and radicals is that they are always suspicious of big ideas. That's what lurks underneath the liberal mindset. And the reason is, and they're quite right in a way, is look what happened last time, when millions of people got swept up in a big idea. Look at the last 100 years at what happened in Russia and then in Germany. The point is that change, political change, is frightening. It's scary. It's thrilling because it is dynamic and it's doing something to change the world. But it is scary because it can change things in ways where nothing is secure. It's like being in an earthquake. Even the solid ground underneath you begins to move and things dissolve that you think are solid and real. And I think that the question liberals and the left have to face at the moment is a really sort of difficult question, which is, do you really want change? Do you really want it?
That's Ian Curtis. It's not Ian Curtis, Adam Curtis again. And I pasted the link in. It's from a longer interview that he on SoundCloud. Oh, that link didn't come out. Anyway, you get a rough idea of where it is, probably on SoundCloud. And I think certainly for me, that sense that there's an urgency here around the need for change and activism, and yet the weight of what that change might be and what the goals might be weigh really heavily on me. Coming from a social science that feels like, I guess at its core, it shouldn't necessarily be interjecting in worlds. And although I feel I've moved on from that, it still is kind of stays with me, the sense that who am I to be kind of inserting a value system? And, as someone who I suppose is familiar and feels a kinship with liberal thinking and maybe even radical thinking, I think Adam Curtis really speaks to that when he talks about real change, or asks the question about real change. So I just wanted to ask the panelists in closing about that question of change and activism, and how should we be thinking about change and activism in design, or I think in Sarayu's case around policy and intervention. And to come back to Foucault, I like the shift feminists have made from Foucault's use of the conditions of possibility. So where Foucault has thought about the conditions, i.e. the structures, as making society possible, I think the feminists are like Haraway and Maria Puig de Bellacasa are asking questions around that are more optimistically phrased around what might just be possible, or even in Arundhati Roy's case, the pandemic is a portal. For Arundhati Roy, the portal there is a possibility. It's like what might be, what the world be like. And I think that is a really enticing way of starting to think about the future, is this idea of a more optimistic set of possibilities. Sarayu, would you like to respond to that? Oh, you're muted, Sarayu.
Yes. So this question of change and activism is really, so there's a personal navigation that I have done to set up Aapti, which sort of looks at some questions, I guess, around technology in society and the ways in which technology may be better understood, or questions of some of these things may be better understood, and how do you do them is really what we're trying to do. I don't know what the current moment has done is it's visibilized centuries, and I speak with specific reference to India. We made apparent or made it impossible, and I think this should have happened earlier, but impossible to reckon with centuries of injustice. And I think, therefore, to not speak at the moment is in some form is a form of violence almost. So to me, anything that I do, or anything that, and I can speak only from a personal space, I guess, in this, anything that I do, anything that I think about, anything that I talk about must contend with questions of justice, must contend with questions of what systems are doing, what, all of these sort of questions that we talk about in a theoretical sense, we must talk about them, we must articulate a position even. So to go beyond sort of understanding to articulating positions. So I do think there are normative positions that we need to take, and it is imperative, it is urgent, and everybody must. The other sort of thing that I think that one needs to talk about a little bit more is this idea of passing the mic. I think there's very much a tendency that a lot of how you look at the world visibilizes what you are allowed to see, or what you can see. And so that's fine, but it's really not the true answer, or whatever you might want to call it. So you're actually not, you're not doing justice to the idea of justice if you don't pass the mic. So I think that it's imperative for scholars, it's imperative for anybody who has a voice to pull in more people, to pull in more scholars, more thinkers, more anybody. Everybody should have a voice, and it is at this moment that we must do it more. So I I don't know if that speaks to the questions of change and activism, but I think we also need to reflect on how we do the change and activism. Like this process must also be reflected upon.
Thank you, Sarayu. That really resonates with me, and you know, questions of, for me, around multiplicity and bringing more people to the table are so critical and you know, so hard. That's something that Daniela and I have been thinking a lot about with the Interactions magazine, and it's, you know, these things are, again, we're facing the most structural issues, which, you know, many of you will know about that, but they're difficult issues to contend with because people get hurt. Anyway, Daniela, would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm just thinking about what this means to pass the mic in the situation we're in right now, because it is, you know, this is my first panel via Zoom, and it's an odd experience to not have the voices of a room, and you know, also visible. And not that panels that are in person are better, very much often the same, but it's interesting to think how we could even facilitate something like that more easily via these mechanisms that we have now. This, you know, not just specific to a Zoom brand, but the kind of form of remote participation that we're trying to encourage. And I think in very much the same way we're imagining for the magazine, how can we even innovate on the modes of knowledge production, or the kinds of citational practices and kinds of ways of circulating knowledge that we, you know, have so long perpetuated via all H indexes and other kinds of, you know, digital library kind of metrics, and that needs rethinking from the start. So how can, I mean, I think this is invitation really. Could we have a discussion as a community as to how a passing of the mic can start on all aspects, right, of our work, including this panel and our magazine participation as well?
Yeah, I can also follow up on that. I think actually Daniela and I were at a conference a couple of summers ago with the Socio-Technical Systems Summer Camp, in which we attempted on a panel also about justice to find a way to kind of pass the mic to someone in, you know, who's also a participant. And so I left the stage kind of halfway through the panel and invited someone else to be on the panel, and it was fun. But one of the things I've been learning, you know, I really appreciated, you know, both of these last comments and specifically Sarayu's point. And I think that this, you know, what we really are talking about is challenging the star cultures within, you know, scholarship, and perhaps also within even communities of activism or other communities, and challenging our notions of meritocracy. And I do think that's something that very few people seem to be willing to admit or understand. And so one thing I've been doing in the last 3 months is just attending a lot of online events. Some of the ones by Haymarket Books have been excellent, and just paying special attention to the ways in which people are convening, the things they say to each other, the way they organize sessions. And I would say they are often strikingly different than what we're familiar with in the academy. And so, you know, I think that those are really instructive for new ways of convening, new ways of organizing, but it is really a relational, you know, sort of person to person and event to event, you know, really changing the dynamics. And that's really difficult work, and we need those models. And so, you know, right now, I think it's a great time to just be paying attention to what other forms and conventions of greetings each, you know, and conventions of listening to each other. Yeah, and I just wanted to add one point is that, you know, in moments of extreme breakdown, I think that is where, you know, certainly where change is possible. And in some of the field sites I've looked at, both with community wireless networks and with medical devices, in both cases, you have kind of corporate accidents where a version of a device was put out that hackers were then able to use and exploit, and that generated a whole community of you know, community wireless networks, or hackers creating their own technologies for diabetics. And so I do think that like the breakdowns and the accidents can be exploited usefully. And so that means that we need to be thinking about, yes, how can we mobilize in this current moment, as much as so many of us are probably spending so much energy just getting through the day-to-day, and taking care of kids and families and things like that. But yeah, I think we should find ways to activate change.
Thank you, Laura. On that note, well, first of all, Emily's just said that we have about 10 minutes left before the room needs to be closed off. But could we pass the mic or invite others to speak? I'm sorry it's taken so long to get to this point. Are there any questions? And either feel free to use the chat channel or just turn on your mic.
Nice question.
Yeah, Emily, yeah.
I was talking a lot in the chat. I think it's been really interesting, and I've worked in social media for a really long time, and it's something that I have kind of seen it grow, and I've seen a lot of the problems come through it. So in terms of technology, it's something that I know a lot about. And I think it's really interesting when we talk about activism, because it's almost like we're asking activists to use these platforms that we know are inherently problematic. We know that they have inherent capitalist problems. We know they're kind of entrenched in a lot of issues. Facebook in particular is known for not reporting things that are problematic and stuff. And I think it's kind of like, where do we go from there? Is there somewhere else that people could go? How do we think about the design of those kind of platforms? Because it's sort of like, yes, they are great for broadcasting, but they've also been known to have a very bad side as well. And they are sort of increasing things like right-wing stuff and that kind of thing as well. So it's not an easy answer, but I just think, yeah, that's kind of something as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've been really inspired by, the ongoing work of like the Design Justice Network, and Sasha Constanza-Shock has a new book out, Design Justice, that sort of speaks to some of those methods of building such platforms for organizing. And I think Luisa Prado and Edna Bonom are examples of friends here who have been doing really important work in this regard of sort of thinking through the mechanisms by which we might actually actively organize these different kinds of worldings, these kinds of organizational forms that don't exist quite yet. And yeah, I think that's maybe it's about the learning and listening and watching and observing and obviously unlearning as well that go with this kind of territory, because it is not work you can start in a minute. It's a kind of lifelong commitment.
I think those, the platforms that we all use, like Facebook and Twitter, just raise so many problems for us. And yet, as we've all seen, they're also such powerful platforms for mobilizing communities. And again, it just speaks to the complications here, that there's no way out from this. There's no, we're not going to find the silver bullet here. It's as Laura said, it's a relational working through. And I think maybe, the call on us as people involved in these projects of building technologies is to sort of think, how do we invite trouble? How do we invite these forms of resistance? Sorry.
Yeah, I also think that very often, and it almost serves the interests of those who build technology to frame questions as breakdowns of process or structure and sometimes even design. They're actually breakdowns of rights, right? So what they do is they make it difficult, and there are sort of different frames that you could come at, from the legal or from the legal standpoint particularly, but to frame them as, privacy is not a design problem. It is a fundamental right, at least, in liberal democratic context, it's a fundamental right that you can enforce in court, guaranteed in some form or fashion, either by a legislation or your constitution. And to think of it as something that can be encoded in design and therefore solved for is in itself problematic. And I think then that's where you begin to, or for me, it is troubling that the idea of justice for me in the context of the digital, therefore, has to be framed in terms of what rights are guaranteed to communities, to individuals, to citizens, and then begin to unpack how both social structures and the technology, the design of the technology itself may intervene or, undo that actually.
That's a lovely point. Sorry. Are there any other questions?
I think it's an interesting point that we suffer from not only often a techno-determinism, but also a design determinism in which we try to then design for, these particular values itself, can be very problematic. But since those are the fields and practices that we've chosen, that's our impulse, but yeah.
Maybe we should wrap it up there. Lots of apologies for people leaving, which is completely understandable. We've run over now 15 minutes. Thank you very much to the panelists and to the audience. If you have an audience on Zoom, I don't know how that works, but it's been fun, and I feel like the conversations have been cut short, so I'm sure they'll continue in different forms and what have you. And but thank you very much for joining the conversation today.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for organizing. I've finally downloaded TikTok.
TikTok is a rabbit hole. At least, I mean, there is an algorithm behind it. So at least in India, it's just, I don't know what to say about it, actually.
Yeah, my kids are just like, my daddy's got a TikTok account. What's your name on TikTok? They're so excited now.
An Indian court banned TikTok because of the problematic content that was on it. So there's quite a lot of actually, also right now we might be at war with China, so people are uninstalling TikTok. So I don't know where things lie, but yeah. TikTok is very political and very emotional in India.
Yeah, it is very political. There's a lot of people using it quite politically as well, particularly in bits of China, because they have I don't know if it's actually TikTok, but they use some form of it, and it's people have been kind of using it in quite a political way as well, which is quite interesting. I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to close this room because I need to go into another room, and I can't be in 2 rooms at once because that's the joy of Zoom. I guess you can't be in 2 rooms at once in real life either. So,
thanks.
But thank you. That was a really great discussion. I'm sorry if I totally just jumped in the chat too much as well.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye everybody.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.